Welcome to the debate. Today we're diving into a really quite ambitious philosophical framework. It's known as the River of Reality, or ROR for short. And this framework, well, it offers a pretty unique lens for understanding the entire Christian biblical narrative, proposing it as a single developmental system that unfolds through distinct hierarchical levels of emergent complexity.
And our discussion today will focus quite rigorously on the efficacy and, I suppose, the appropriateness of this River of Reality framework as a specific interpretive lens. We're really examining its utility for viewing the biblical canon as, well, as what the framework itself terms an evolving technology for social organization.
Exactly. And crucially, we will strictly avoid evaluating any truth claims of dogma, miracles, or faith. We're concentrating solely on the analytical model itself, how it functions and, frankly, how well it illuminates the structural aspects of the text.
Right.
So I'll be arguing for the robust efficacy and illuminating power of this framework. I contend that it provides a uniquely coherent systemic understanding.
And I, on the other hand, will be raising some, let's say, probing questions about its universal appropriateness and potential limitations as a primary interpretive framework, inviting us to consider its boundaries. It's definitely a rich topic, and the ROR model is certainly ambitious in its scope. It offers a compelling invitation to look at familiar text through an entirely new conceptual apparatus.
Absolutely. And from my perspective, the River of Reality framework, it really presents a uniquely powerful and, I think, coherent lens for analyzing the entire Christian Bible. I mean, from Genesis all the way to Revelation, as a singular developmental narrative system. What's truly remarkable about ROR, I find, is its core proposition. It maps the biblical story through these distinct hierarchical levels of emergent complexity. It categorizes narratives as functionally related to science, art, religion, politics, and philosophy. And doing this reveals a structured logical progression, where each level sort of builds upon the output, or the flow, as the framework calls it, of the preceding one. The real strength of this approach lies in its stated objective, focusing on the structural and philosophical function of the text in organizing human society and consciousness. It treats the biblical canon as a complex, evolving technology for social organization, which I think offers profound analytical clarity. For instance, the initial phase in Genesis 1-11 is interpreted as Level 1, Science Study of Truth, Flow of Information, Data. Now, ROR isn't suggesting ancient scientific method here, obviously, but it's mapping the narrative's functional purpose at that stage, establishing foundational truths about reality, much like science seeks objective data. The flow of information is simply the communication of these truths within the system. This initial flow then becomes corrupted. The biblical narrative shows a catastrophic destabilization of this flow of information, and this in turn necessitates the level 2, art, study of membership, to flow of connection established through, say, the Abrahamic Covenant. This provides, I think, a clear systemic cause and effect for the entire progression. It's not just, a series of events. It's a diagnostic understanding of how one systemic breakdown leads to the emergence of a new functional requirement. This perspective truly reframes those early narratives, not as isolated stories, but as foundational components of an evolving social operating system.
Okay. Well, while I certainly appreciate the ROR framework's ambition to provide such a coherent, systemic analysis and its commitment to analyzing the Bible as a functional system, significant questions do arise for me regarding its universal appropriateness and, frankly, potential for reductive interpretation. Imposing a rigid hierarchical model where biblical narratives get categorized as, level 1 science or level 3 religion, well, it risks anachronistically fitting ancient texts into very modern systems thinking paradigms. Even with a non-theological analysis, this might inadvertently distort rather than illuminate the text's inherent complexities. It raises the question for me, are we uncovering the Bible's own systemic logic, or are we maybe just applying a modern template onto it?
Moreover, the framework's, let's say, exclusive focus on the Bible as an evolving technology for social organization and its output as these flows like flow of information or flow of hierarchy. Well, that might sideline or perhaps oversimplify other valid non-theological ways of interpreting a narrative system. Think about internal literary coherence, the development of character arcs, or an ethical evolution that doesn't solely aim at societal mechanics. Now, these elements certainly impact social organization, I grant that, but reducing them exclusively to this functional output could flatten their multifaceted nature. And the very definition of the ROR levels, like Level 1, Science, Study of Truth, or Level 3, Religion, Study of Value, they carry implicit philosophical assumptions that, while articulated, might not seamlessly align with the nuanced content of the biblical text being mapped. It feels like it could potentially force the narrative into these predetermined conceptual boxes.
You raise a compelling point about the risk of anachronism, and it's certainly a valid concern for any interpretive framework looking at ancient texts through modern lenses. However, I believe Rara deftly navigates this by focusing on the functional rather than, say, the historical or cultural definition of these levels. It's not about imposing modern science on Genesis, but about identifying Genesis 1 to 11 as the narrative's attempt to establish fundamental truths about reality, functionally similar to how science seeks objective data. The Rara framework, I think, robustly demonstrates how biblical phases structurally address preceding systemic failures, revealing genuine emergent complexity. This isn't retrofitting, in my view. It's revealing the underlying architecture of a developing system. Consider the period of the Judges, for example. The framework accurately identifies this as a failure of Level 3 religion value without Level 5 politics force, creating an explicit functional demand for a flow of governance. This narrative of systemic breakdown, as outlined in Judges, directly and logically leads to the request for a king in 1 Samuel. This perspective really reframes the events, internally justifying the necessity of the state not as just some historical accident, but as a systemic solution to a diagnosed problem. Furthermore, the New Testament's Christ event, well, it's presented not as a minor reform, but as a comprehensive philosophical intervention, providing an entirely new framework, fundamentally recoding values and membership. This illustrates a profound systemic reboot and true developmental progression, making it, I think, a powerful interpretive tool for understanding the biblical arc as a dynamic, evolving system.
That's a compelling argument for the internal consistency within the ROR model, yes. And I do appreciate the emphasis on function over simple anachronism. However, I still have reservations about whether the specific hierarchical mapping of ROR truly represents an, let's say, emergent understanding from the biblical text itself, or if it's still more of an imposed interpretive layer. For instance, labeling Genesis 1:11's creation account as Level 1, Science Flow of Information, it just feels like a very specific, modern conceptual overlay. While I understand the framework's intent to identify foundational truths, does this particular categorization fully capture the narrative's primary function, even from a purely systemic viewpoint, or is it perhaps streamlining it to fit that predetermined schema?
Right.
And to push further on the Judges example you gave, while there's clearly a demand for a flow of governance, is it necessarily a failure of Level 3 without Level 5 as defined specifically by ROR? Or could it perhaps be interpreted more broadly as a general social breakdown demanding centralized authority, without needing the precise ROR categories to explain the logic? The text presents a breakdown, yes, absolutely. But does it present it in these specific terms of Level 3 without Level 5 that then requires the exact ROR solution? My concern remains that the framework might risk retrofitting the narrative into its predetermined levels, rather than, letting the narrative reveal its own organizational principles. The diagnostic power you speak of might derive more from the framework's internal logic than from an objective reading of the text's inherent structure.
But that's precisely where ROR offers clarity and, I'd argue, a more precise diagnostic tool. While a general social breakdown is certainly evident in Judges, The framework argues that identifying it as a failure of level 3 religion value without level 5 politics force allows us to diagnose the specific functional gap that then requires a political solution, rather than just any solution. It's about systemic precision. It highlights that the existing religious and ethical structures, level 3, were insufficient to maintain order without the coercive power of a centralized political system, level 5. It pinpoints why the demand for a king arises in 1 Samuel, not just because things are chaotic, but because a specific systemic function is missing. It helps us understand the logic of the transition.
I see the appeal of that systemic precision, I do, and indeed the Bible often provides internal logic for its transitions. But does that precision come at the cost of interpretive flexibility, maybe? Or the acknowledgement of multiple valid systemic interpretations? For instance, ancient societies didn't necessarily compartmentalize these levels as distinctly as Roanoke seems. The lines between religion, politics, and art were often far more fluid, wouldn't you agree? So while Roanoke offers a clear, defined set of terms, the very act of defining them so rigidly and applying them to an ancient narrative might introduce its own form of distortion, even if it's unintended. It's a powerful model, certainly, but is it the most appropriate one for the inherent nature of the source material itself?
Well, I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning because the framework's strength, I believe, lies precisely in its ability to abstract and analyze the Bible as a technology for social organization. It provides scalable concepts that elucidate the narrative's practical utility for any complex society. This isn't about imposing modern labels on ancient concepts, so much as recognizing universal systemic patterns. Take the Mosaic Law, for example, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. The framework interprets this not just as a set of religious rules, but as level 3 religion ethics, study of value, producing a flow of hierarchy. Now, what's insightful here is that this flow of hierarchy scales trust beyond just kinship ties. It acts as a profoundly sophisticated social technology that lowers transaction costs for a nascent nation. It provides a shared moral and legal framework, allowing diverse groups to cooperate on a much larger scale.
That's a profound insight, I think, into how the law functions systemically, beyond just its theological pronouncements. Similarly, the Pauline synthesis, Romans, Galatians, etc., is presented as a capstone-level act of philosophical abstraction. It provides the rigorous philosophical framework, or if you like, the portable source code, that enables a localized movement to become a global system of thought. This language clearly elucidates the practical, systemic utility of the biblical narrative in shaping human societies. It moves beyond mere theological description to explaining its operational dynamics and scalability. It truly helps us understand how these texts functioned and continue to function as social architects.
I approach it a bit differently. While the Bible undeniably has profound implications for social organization, and its texts can certainly be analyzed for their functional outputs, reducing its narrative and philosophical richness exclusively to technology for social organization or defining its outputs simply as flows, well, it might flatten its multifaceted nature. Does referring to complex narrative elements as flow of information, flow of connection, or flow of governance really adequately capture the nuanced ethical, social, or philosophical principles embedded within the text? For instance, let's consider the prophetic tradition. ROR describes it as the system's first iteration of the capstone level, philosophy, generating a nascent flow of consciousness. Okay, while it highlights a particular function, does this terminology truly enhance our understanding of the prophet's unique critical function? Their deep appeals to individual moral responsibility, or their articulation of justice that isn't solely about societal mechanics, but also about the direct relationship between humanity and a transcendent ideal? I worry that this precise functional terminology, while internally consistent, might constrain our understanding of the broader scope and depth of these narrative elements. It risks overlooking other important aspects of their discourse that aren't strictly reducible to flows within a social technology. It's a powerful way to look at it, yes, but is it the most appropriate or the most comprehensive lens?
I understand your concern about potential reductionism, and it's a fair point that abstraction always carries some cost. However, I would argue that the framework's intent isn't to diminish the richness of the biblical narrative, but rather to abstract it to a functional level precisely to uncover its underlying systemic patterns and operational principles. When we talk about flow of consciousness in relation to the prophets, for instance, it's about recognizing their role in introducing new ways of thinking, challenging existing paradigms, and expanding the moral and conceptual landscape, which is a form of philosophical intervention that directly impacts a society's self-awareness and direction. The beauty of this framework, I think, is that it helps us understand how these profound ethical and philosophical insights actually operate within a larger societal system. It provides a language to discuss the Bible's influence as a dynamic, evolving force, rather than just a collection of static stories or abstract ideas. It moves from what the text says to how it works, and that's a crucial distinction. It's not about replacing other interpretive lenses, but offering a powerful complementary one focused on the Bible's practical utility in shaping human social structures and thought.
I see the framework's attempt to operationalize these concepts, yes, and the appeal of understanding the how, but the choice of language itself shapes our perception, doesn't it? When we emphasize technology for social organization and define outcomes as flows, we inherently foreground certain aspects of the text while potentially de-emphasizing others. Does flow of hierarchy truly capture the moral and, dare I say, spiritual implications of the Mosaic Law, or does it primarily prioritize its administrative efficiency? The prophets, for example, were not just generating a flow of consciousness in a purely systemic sense, they were also delivering urgent ethical critiques, calls for repentance, and promises of spiritual renewal that seem to transcend purely organizational functions. Now, these certainly impact social organization, I agree, but their primary intent might be understood differently. The language of roar, while precise, might steer us too narrowly towards a purely functional interpretation, missing some of that richness.
That's an interesting point, though I might frame it slightly differently. The roar framework provides what I see as a compelling and coherent ultimate purpose for the entire biblical system in its conclusion. It moves from what it calls the river of reality to the ocean of self-awareness. Now, this isn't just a convenient ending tacked on. It's presented as a deeply integrated telos, a systemic resolution that ties everything together. The vision of the New Jerusalem in Revelation 21:22, for example, is powerfully interpreted within this framework as a perfect integration of all the roar flows. This isn't just seen as allegory, but as a detailed blueprint of a perfected system. Here, level 1, flow of information, manifests as perfect clarity, unmediated truth, no deception. Level 3, flow of hierarchy, becomes obsolete because there's direct, unmediated access to value and ethical guidance, negating the need for intermediaries. Even level 5, flow of governance, is rendered unnecessary because there's no conflict or need for coercive force within this perfectly integrated state. The ultimate promise of seeing his face and having his name on their foreheads is interpreted as the complete realization of the flow of consciousness, signifying a perfected holistic self-understanding and unity with its source. This provides a deeply integrated, systemic telos that brings the entire framework to a satisfying logical resolution, showing the full developmental arc of the system. It offers a powerful interpretive key to the eschatological vision.
I'm sorry, but I just don't quite buy that it naturally emerges from the biblical text quite as universally as the framework might suggest. While the concept of a unifying telos is appealing, certainly, one has to critically evaluate whether the ocean of self-awareness metaphor and the specific interpretation of Revelation's New Jerusalem as a perfect integration of ROR flows. Is that a conclusion that emerges naturally from the biblical text itself, or is it primarily a logical culmination of the ROR framework's own internal logic? Does this framework's pursuit of perfect integration and resolution inadvertently smooth over, perhaps, some remaining complexities or ambiguities within the textual depictions of the end state? For instance, other valid non-ROR systemic or philosophical analyses of biblical eschatology
might present alternative understandings of this ultimate purpose without imposing the specific ROR definitions of flows and their perfected state. It feels like the framework might be projecting its own ideal systemic conclusion back onto the material, rather than solely deriving it from the narrative's own multi-layered and sometimes quite open-ended depictions of the future. I mean, the text of Revelation, for example, is incredibly rich and symbolic. To distill it into a perfect integration of flows risks simplifying its profound poetic and, yes, spiritual dimensions.
I understand your concern that any framework, by its very nature, creates a lens that might prioritize certain interpretations. That's fair. However, the Rohr framework doesn't claim to be the only valid interpretation, but rather offers a powerful and coherent systemic one. The ocean of self-awareness, I would argue, isn't projected onto the text. It's a metaphor that articulates the framework's understanding of what the biblical narrative itself seems to be striving towards, a state of perfect information, value, and governance, leading ultimately to complete and integrated consciousness. It provides a means to connect what might otherwise appear as disparate eschatological images into a single cohesive functional conclusion. It allows us to understand the purpose behind the entire biblical system's evolution. So, while other interpretations exist, absolutely, Rohr offers a unique and internally consistent way to understand the biblical narrative as a functional system moving towards a specific integrated end state.
That interpretation is the most appropriate or comprehensive given the textual nuances. The pursuit of perfect integration, while certainly appealing from a systems perspective, might inadvertently gloss over elements within the narrative that suggest a different kind of resolution, or perhaps even deliberately unresolved tensions. Ultimately, while the framework provides a compelling internal logic, we must always ask if that logic truly captures the full scope of the text it seeks to interpret, or if it inevitably guides the interpretation towards its own predefined systemic ideals.
Ultimately, I believe the River of Reality framework presents an invaluable and robust lens for analyzing the Christian biblical narrative as a powerful, evolving system. It offers a clear, hierarchical mapping that illuminates the structural and philosophical functions of the text in organizing human society and consciousness from, the initial corruption of information all the way to a perfected state of integrated, self-aware existence. It provides a unique and potent tool for understanding the Bible's operational dynamics.
And I'd conclude by saying that while the River of Reality framework certainly provides an interesting and thought-provoking systems analysis of the Bible, its specific categorical structure and strong conceptual definitions do warrant critical consideration. It serves as a useful tool, absolutely, for highlighting certain aspects of the biblical narrative's organizational function, but its appropriateness and comprehensive efficacy as the sole or perhaps even primary interpretive framework for such a complex and multifaceted narrative system, well, that may be limited. It certainly invites further exploration of diverse systemic and philosophical approaches.
And that really speaks to the richness of the source material itself, doesn't it? And the enduring value of engaging with such innovative frameworks to deepen our understanding of complex narratives.
Indeed. The Bible is a text that invites, it seems, almost endless interpretive lenses. Listeners are certainly encouraged to consider these different perspectives, perhaps explore the biblical arc through River of Reality framework for themselves, and continue their own journey of understanding.